he said, if you just put your baby in a room, they'll just cry it out and eventually they'll be fine, right? They'll learn to self-soothe. But that's not a real thing. Children don't learn to self-soothe. Guess what they learned? They can't rely on you.
Starting these conversations early on, whether they understand whatever capacity of it, it builds that foundation and they start picking up. And again, at this early of an age, she might not understand, but just starting that conversation and she'll eventually pick up to understanding what that means. And maybe I'll understand more on her level of what she's experiencing.
Just creating little ways that we can be present with our kids and not, your kid seeing this, because I think that's another big issue. On a side note, I think that's another huge issue is what's going to happen to kids that have grown up with their parents not looking at them in the face.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Wellness for Life. I'm your host, Niki Wolf, and today we're going to be diving into a topic that most parents of young children are all too familiar with, toddler tantrums. So joining us to help unpack this is Dr. Taylor Harper. Dr. Harper is a dedicated child psychologist, an award-winning children's book author, and a passionate advocate for promoting mental health through a holistic lens. As a homeschooling mother, she understands the unique challenges and joys of raising children. Her approach empowers families to create enriching environments that foster both the emotional and intellectual growth, inspiring both children and parents alike. So today we're going to be covering everything from the causes of toddler tantrums and common parenting challenges to these practical techniques for teaching emotional regulation. So we'll also discuss proactive strategies for preventing tantrums, tips for responding calmly when they happen, and even the impact of nutrition on toddler behavior. So there's so much valuable advice in store. Let's get started. Thank you so much, Dr. Harper, for being here.
Wow. You make me sound really cool. You make me sound really, really cool. Thank you for having me and letting me kind of talk about, all the things that I'm really passionate about and things that I kind of see every day.
Absolutely. Well, selfishly, I have a child in the midst of this. So this was particularly pressing for me, wanting to know the tips and tricks, but I'm sure there's so many out there that are going through similar stages of life. But before we dive into the logistics and these tips, I'd love to lay out, how did you get into this field? Share a little bit more about your background.
Yeah. So for everyone out there who originally started in one place and ended up in another, that was absolutely me. So I started out in college pre-med, and I got my first C. And my anatomy teacher told me that I'd never be a doctor, which was kind of wild, getting my first C. And I came out of the class and I was like, oh my gosh, my life is over. This is never going to happen. I went into my guidance counselor to kind of talk about my next year. And he said, you have a minor in psychology. And I said, well, how's that possible? I didn't sign up for any classes. And he said, it's just the classes that you've taken as electives. So I really started to ponder why that was, right? Why I was continuing to take all of these classes in the same category. So that next semester I switched and I never looked back. So, I'm a big advocate for everything happens for a reason. And the moment that I switched, my life just totally clicked. It just all made sense. Life became really easy because I really enjoyed what I was doing.
I love when that happens, when things align and they're for the right reasons. It's just a no-brainer to go down that path. And I think there's some obvious signs where that's a hard no, that's a hard yes. And clearly this was, a hard yes for you. So that's awesome.
Yes. And I never have to dissect another animal again.
I remember that in our middle school and high school, dissecting frogs. And I don't know, what do people do? Rats?
Yeah, we did cats, we did rats, we did frogs. The cat was hard for me. It was, yeah.
Oh, I bet. Well, very cool. Well, we will kind of jump into things, kind of the takeaways that everybody's here waiting for. But I want to start out with some common parenting challenges. What are some of the common challenges that parents face? I can imagine that these really shape toddler behavior as well. And so what are some of the ways that parents can work through these?
Sure. So a couple of things that I think really, really hit home to why parents are seeing some of the behaviors that they do. Number one, bribery. Don't do it. Please don't do it. I know it's easy. Right? It's convenient. However, your child is then always going to assume that they receive something in order to complete the task, right? So we want them to learn complete tasks because they want to, or because they feel like it's the right thing to do, not because they're given something in return. Number two, tantrums, obviously, which we're going to get into. The more that you engage with the tantrum, the worse it's probably going to get. Mm-hmm. Because at the end of the day, you're showing attention. So there's a quote, and I don't use them very often, but I will in this situation. So the Kardashians used to say, any publicity is publicity, right? Good or bad, right? So the same applies with tantrums. If you're drawing attention to it, even if you're yelling at your child, even if you're, completely mad and over the top, right? You're still giving them attention. Mm-hmm. Right. So we have to kind of shift that and give them attention in the right way, not giving them attention in a way that's still going to make them feel like they're getting what they want. Number three, one of my least favorite things on the planet is parents not following through. So I promise you, in our house, if I say something, I mean it. Right. And that's really hard sometimes. Right. If I tell my kid I'm going to go get him ice cream and it's 10 at night, I'm like, oh, shoot. Right. But I will then look at him and we'll have a conversation. I'll be like, I'm so sorry. I totally forgot. It's a little bit late now. How about we go do it tomorrow? And most of the time we can work through that at this point. Now he is 4. Okay. So that's, this has been over time. But initially, sometimes just me apologizing, right? And being honest with, hey, I forgot. Hey, I messed up. Right? Because a lot of times parents don't do that. It's just like, oh, you'll be fine. You'll get over it. It's just ice cream. Right? But to them, it's everything. So I think those are like the 3 things that I see in a lot of parents that just drive me crazy. There's no other.
And it's the last one that you mentioned that I've usually heard like the flip of it. So you're kind of mentioning something like, oh gosh, I got to go do this. A lot of times I hear the parents like, let's say you're taking your kids somewhere fun and they start freaking out, and fun for you as well. I don't know, amusement park or who knows what. And you say, if you do that one more time, we're going to leave. But really deep down, you don't want to leave. And so I'm hearing from other parents that, well, okay, they just like let it slide because they want to stay there. And to your point, and this is something that I've deeply known, and I'm kind of starting to walk into the phase. My daughter's about 19 months. So we're about to get into this phase where, all right, you got to stick to what you're saying. So I can see it on both ends of the spectrum of like, gosh, I want to be here and we'll let this slide or let them do whatever. But also, the harder things. And I'd love to explore this about tantrums because, and I don't know if there's an age range where it tends to start, but I'm really noticing, I'll have to bring up my personal experiences because this is just what I'm going through. But I feel like there's so many different factors going on. They don't know how to communicate. They're learning so many new things at a rapid speed. Teething. My daughter got teeth way later, so her molars just popped, and just exploring and discovering. So there's all that, but so there's the empathy and the sympathy for what they're going through and that understanding. Yet also there's a role I have to play of not feeding into it, but also disciplining in the right way, especially when, and maybe we'll get into it, when hitting occurs, all these things. And so there's so many different angles to look at it. And how do we go best about this with parents? I don't know. It's just like an overwhelming thing. So I know tantrums are a big hurdle for parents. And so from this psychological perspective, what do you see causes tantrums?
Sure. And I think hopefully I can swear on this podcast. And if not, just edit me out later. But eventually your kids are going to learn that you're full of shit. Truly. If you don't follow through, they're going to learn that. Right. Mm-hmm. And that's what they're going to take away from that. Right. If I throw a tantrum, if I have these big feelings, if I, start throwing or hitting or kicking, right, I'm going to get what I want. And, maybe they're not going to follow through. Right. So they're going to say, hey, if you do this one more time, right, if you throw that, we're leaving. Right. Well, you're not really going to leave. So why say it? Mm-hmm. Right. Don't make a threat that you have no intention on following through with. Mm-hmm. Right. And that's the word is like threat. Right. A lot of times parents are just making threats. Mm. And eventually your child is going to learn that you don't mean it. And then they're going to say, okay, well, I'm willing to challenge that because I don't think you mean it. And so then we're kind of falling into this trap of now what, right? Now you've proven that they can't trust you. Mm-hmm. right? So then they're going to go kind of off on their own and gain. And yes, we want our children to gain independence. Absolutely. But we don't want them to feel like they can't trust their parent, right? And I know that sounds like really extreme, but that's what it is, right? They're saying like, I need to make my own decisions because I can't trust that you're going to follow through on what you say.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And that comes back to, I know, maybe a little off topic, but that comes back to even as babies, right? So there's this concept of cry it out, right? Which is not a real thing. It's absolutely not a real thing. So it was invented around the time that moms were starting to go into the workforce and things like that. So it was made up by a pediatrician, actually. And he said, if you just put your baby in a room, they'll just cry it out and eventually they'll be fine, right? They'll learn to self-soothe. But that's not a real thing. Children don't learn to self-soothe. Guess what they learned? They can't rely on you. And so eventually they continue that on into life. I can't rely on you. I can't rely on you. I can't rely on you. I need to form my own opinions, my own thoughts, because I can't go to my parents and say, hey, what about this? Hey, what about that? Right. And then we just keep this cycle going. And then eventually, as they get into teenagers, they're going to do the same thing. Hey, I can't rely on my parents, so I'm going to make my own choices.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it sounds really extreme, right? But it's day one, really sitting down and hitting home some of these like concepts that seem fundamental to moms, right? Like I know for me being a parent, it all came very natural to me, right? I was like, the cried out thing doesn't make sense, right? So why am I doing it? I'm not going to, right? Putting my child in timeout when they have a tantrum doesn't make sense to me. I'm not going to do it. And our child has never heard the word timeout. I don't like it. I hate it because it doesn't make sense. Why would I shove my child in a room by themselves in the corner and say, go figure it out yourself?
So what is our approach then? Let's bring up a circumstance. So, I mean, we can, maybe you have some, examples that happen and how do we go about it?
Sure. So, a good example, right? So kind of my son at your daughter's age, right, was kind of going through these big tantrums and didn't really understand how to communicate those things. So the first thing I started with him was identifying emotions, right? So at about your daughter's age, I was teaching him emotions, right? So I'd say, show me happy face. And he would like get all excited. And then I would say, show me surprise face. And then he would go like this. And we have and now we have these adorable pictures with him doing that.
At 19 months?
Yes. I know. It was a lot of work. Trust me. I was doing it all the time, the time, like constant. And for everyone listening, I will happily show them photos. But it was like a daily occurrence, right? Where I was like, show me this, show me that. And eventually, like, right, I was showing him how to express those things. And he might not have always known what I was doing, but I was laying the foundation, right? It doesn't always have to make sense, right? Like a lot of people say all the time, like, oh, don't take your kid to Disney because they'll never remember. That's okay. I will, right? I'm there, right? And they might not remember it, but maybe deep down, they find a love for something like that. And maybe it's because intrinsically you took them, right? So I think when we're having these moments with tantrums, so like a story that comes to my mind is when we were kind of in the midst of these really big feelings and these really big tantrums, I would just sit there. To be honest, I didn't do anything. I knew that my response wasn't going to change, but I wasn't going to leave him alone either, right? I'm not going to say, hey, go sit by yourself and figure this out. So I sat next to him. And I said, hey, when you're ready, I'm more than willing to give you a hug. Do you want a hug? Right? I respected his space as well. I wasn't trying to force a hug on him. I wasn't trying to like make everything better. And I think that's the problem is we're always trying to make things better. But we don't need to. Let your kid cry. It's okay. I knew there was nothing wrong with him, right? He wasn't injured. He was sitting in the room right next to me. He is absolutely allowed to have all the feelings. He's just not allowed to hit and throw. Right. So if he started throwing, then I would say, hey, we don't throw. Right. Do you need something else? Is there an activity that we can do safely that will help you? Right. And now we do a lot of that more that he's 4. Right. So we'll do, we have this thing on Amazon, those like they're like stackable little couches.
Okay. I'm not familiar, but I can put it together.
I'll show you. Yeah. So they're like little stackable things and you can make different, You can make like houses and things out of them.
Oh,
So
yes, I totally
yes.
do. We have one. I got it from Costco, but yes, I know exactly what you're talking about.
So they have on Amazon, they have a little like Velcro thing and it goes around the outside and then it has like a screen. And so it'll have like a pitcher or a hockey goalie or something like that. And there's little holes in them and he can just go and throw and he's not hitting anything because there's a back to it because we got this little play couch and he can throw as hard as he wishes. Nobody's getting injured, right? And he's getting out his anger in a way that makes sense for him. Right. Yeah. And so I think we're always like trying to shut feelings down. It's like, why? Like,
so you mentioned a good point, and I've had this conversation with my husband because right now we're going through the hitting and just so much built up frustration, and she's hitting, and a lot of times she's taking it out on me. And I guess a few things that I've pulled from this, and I'm curious, is I've read, because there's so many styles and ways to parents, like you got to figure out what works, but also, I've read different things of don't like. My first things reading were, okay, we don't hit in this family. Then I've also heard that saying don't hit isn't helpful because kids almost have to like, okay, hit and then don't. So you kind of have to reverse and it takes a lot of steps. So what I've heard instead is give them direction of you can use your hands to clap. You can use your hands to hit or not hit. You know what I mean? What you can do, or you can put your hands over here. So there's those different things that I want to pull apart. And then the second thing that my husband brought up, because he works in social work. And so he, done a lot of psychology classes as well. And so I'm curious is at first I was like, okay, well, we can throw a pillow to kind of get our energy out. But one thing he mentioned is not that it's right or wrong. And I'm just curious your perspective is he mentioned that's still another form of aggression. Now, like, you know what I mean? Because he does like jujitsu and MMA, and granted, that's fighting for an exercise, but to take out your anger, it's still aggression. Is there a problem with that? Even though it's not towards a kid or a person, because before he even mentioned that, I was like, okay, throw the pillow or stomp on this or throw a hockey puck. I don't see a problem with that. Yeah. So I don't know. I guess I'm a little bit confused on the direction. I know that was a lot.
Sure. No. So I have two boys. So let me start with that. So aggression, I believe, is inevitable a little bit, right? Like my 4-year-old at night is like, let me wrestle with dad, right? It's not let me wrestle with mom. It's let me wrestle with dad, right? There's this physical nature to kids. And it's funny because I think of a story. We went over to a friend's house and they have girls about our son's age. And we got in the car and my husband was like, oh my gosh, we need to discipline our son, like, which I hate that word as well. But he was like, we need to discipline our son. He's just all over the place, blah, blah. And I was like, oh, you saw the girls, didn't you? And he was like, yeah, what? And I was like, we're innately different and that's okay, right? We are innately different and it's completely okay. And I know there are going to be, people that say like everybody's the same, right? But I can see the difference between a little boy and a little girl. And I can tell you that my son is going to be significantly more physical, right? Yeah. And so I think it's okay to allow that, right? In a safe space, which is why I say, hey, we don't throw, we don't hit your brother. We can, however, go upstairs. And if you want to throw into that pillow, go for it, right? Have at it. I made a rock climbing wall in our house. He climbs that thing all the time and then he'll go, jumping down. Right. And that's kind of his way of getting that energy out. We do something called at night, we'll do pillow chops. So before we go to bed, I'll let him like chop the pillow or he'll come running from the end of our bed and he'll do like a kick in the air. Right. So I think it's okay. Right. I think it's inevitably a part of life. Right. It's just how we manage it. Right. Because I don't want to shut it down. I don't want to say your feelings are too big for me or your feelings are too aggressive for me. I don't like that. Right. It's how can we manage that feeling in a helpful and functional way? Right. Because when you shut down a feeling, you're saying, I don't like that feeling. We don't like that. Go deal with that over there. Right. And then we later in life maybe come into things like anxiety, depression, right? Because we've shut down these feelings that we don't deem as good.
And I think especially when it comes to, I think women have I very much believe that there's very distinct differences. But generally men shut down a lot of that stuff. And so it can present itself as anger later on, or resentment, or all these other things. And so it's like, I think part of being human is feeling the full spectrum of emotions. And I talk about that as an adult. So why is it not for children? It's just hard because it's all happening so fast in a small area, and their capacity for understanding is so minimal. And so that's why I just want to be so conscious of my approach, and I'm not going to do everything right. You're going to get, the chances of snapping or doing things the wrong way are probably fairly common when you just feel so burnt out. But so that makes sense. Now, what are your thoughts on kind of saying, I don't know if there's harm to that. Like, I like the approach of we don't hit, or we don't yell, or we don't do this in this family, and then kind of giving them, this is what we can do.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest thing, is giving an alternative, right? So because a lot of people will just say, we don't hit, we don't kick, we don't do this, right? But you're not giving them a skill, right? You're just saying we don't, right? And that's what timeout does as well, right? You're not giving them a skill. You're putting them in the corner and you're saying, hey, I don't like how you're feeling. I don't like what you're doing, but I'm not going to tell you what you can do, because that emotion is still there, right? So I think finding ways to address it for your own family, right? However that works, right? For us, it's clearly being physical, or telling him, hey, let's go climb the climbing wall, or let's take a walk, or let's, you want to wrestle with dad, fine. My poor husband.
And I think that's partially what dads are there for. It's like mothers have this like calming and care, that the kids and babies come to us for some things. And I think it's like the wildness and the adventure and like the rough and tough, I think is a value. And I think that's where they can safely go to dads generally for that.
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, he, with me, it's feelings, it's emotions, it's, I have a boo-boo, so I need help, right? With dad, it's very much like, and sometimes I think dad gets a little resentful too, that he can't be that super safe, comforting space. And he always has to be this like rough kind of, but I just remind him that like, that is how he sees you. And that's kind of the way that he wants to see you. Right.
Totally.
I don't get to be the rough one, right? He's not running up asking me to wrestle with him. So I think it's just finding ways that work best for you, but not shunning the feelings, right? Not saying, hey, these aren't good enough, right? Try to be happier, right? Just try to be happier, right? Like that's not an answer. And so I think, the best thing for me, the two best things that I think, if anyone listening to this podcast takes anything out of this whole conversation, number one is always following through. And number two is setting expectations. I always have a conversation with our 4-year-old. I treat him as if he is another adult, right? So I say, hey, this is what we're going to do today. This is what we have to do. This is what we have to accomplish. Let's get ready. Let's do this, right? And when I lay out that day and I constantly remind him of what's happening, then it makes life so much easier because he knows what to expect, right? A lot of times we're running around in chaos, right? And we're constantly here and there and everywhere else. And our kids are just along for the ride. But we never really like sit down and be like, hey, this is what's going on. This is what we're going to do today. How do you feel about this? Right? I think sometimes we treat kids like they are just a part of the family, but they're not the highest of the priorities, right? It's like me and dad have a conversation, but why am I not having that conversation with you? And that's where kind of my Nordic influence has come in, right? It's really all about this whole bigger family system. And so I think truly, if you take two things away from that, set expectations and follow through. Like I cannot say that enough.
Yeah.
And timers are incredible. My son will now set his own timer. If he's like, okay, I'm going to be on my iPad, right? 5 minutes. Okay. Sounds good. Right. And then he'll get off it when the timer goes off. But I've set those expectations, right? You are on your tablet. We're not going to live on our tablet. I will allow you to play on it, but then we're done and we're moving on.
Yeah.
So I think those are like really the biggest things with tantrums. And then just time. I mean, really time, right? With all things, time kind of heals a lot.
Absolutely. One thing I'd like to kind of explore, and you spoke about earlier on, is kind of this, and maybe this will be for a bigger episode, but this Nordic approach. What is that, and kind of what are the bullets of that?
Nordic parenting is something that I think I really got into when we went to Amsterdam. I absolutely fell in love with this concept, right? So as an example, in Copenhagen, they leave their kids like little babies, right? They leave them in the stroller outside while they're having coffee. And
like you saw that. It wasn't just like virtually you saw it. You saw it in real life.
Yes.
I know. I've seen that online.
It is insane to me. And I don't remember her name. However, I do follow a woman who used to live in the US and now lives in Copenhagen. And I'm absolutely obsessed, totally obsessed. And so I kind of went down this rabbit hole, started listening to some audiobooks, and just really got into the concept of Nordic parenting as a whole and how they just really prioritize the family, right? Like in the US, I think we're so rushed and we're so, and maybe people aren't going to like me for this one, but we prioritize work, right? And it's like, I think about it in this concept of if something were to happen to me tomorrow, who would miss me? Would it be my work or would it be my family? And at the end of the day, it's my family, right? My kids need me. My work needs me, but they would replace me. My family can't replace me. And so I think there's this bigger concept of learning to slow down, learning to be present, right? And I know in the world that we live in, it's so hard. But I think any way that you can just kind of slow down and be more present, right? And not so focused on what's next or what's going on with work, right? So something that we do at night, from the time I get home from work, which is around 6 o'clock-ish, to the time that the kids go to bed, which is at 9, we don't have any cell phones. Unless we are like calling family or things like that, because all of our family is back in the Midwest. Unless we're FaceTiming them, we don't have cell phones. Because that is the time that we're all together. So we put the kids to bed together. We do kind of the whole thing, right? And I think just creating little ways that we can be present with our kids and not, your kid seeing this 24/7. Because I think that's another big issue. On a side note, like, I think that's another huge issue is what's going to happen to kids that have grown up with their parents not looking at them in the face.
Yeah.
And constantly talking to them around this thing that's like this. How are your children going to learn emotions if they can't see yours?
Yeah. Well, and I'm reading a lot on, being able to counsel them, especially in the middle of a tantrum. And it's like, get on their level, put some hand contact on them, but look them in the eye and wait until they look you back in the eye. And to your point, it's like, if we're looking at a screener and I'm, a big culprit of I'm constantly taking photos and videos. And so she sees the phone very often. I'm pretty intentional about like, very, very limited screen time because, the more research you hear and do, just how detrimental it can be to their upbringing, especially at such a pivotal age.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, so the situation that we were kind of talking about earlier with my son. So what I did was we have like 2 gates. So the gates, he was throwing a tantrum. He was throwing himself all over the floor. And I immediately just sat down next to him and I just sat. I didn't do anything else, right? I didn't try to fix him. I didn't try to say like, we're not going to do this or we're not going to act this way. He's in a safe space. He's in his like area where he can play and do all the things that he needs to do. And so to me, I just sat and I waited and I just reminded him, I said, I love you and I'm here for you. And eventually he stood up and he knew that I was right there, right? He knew I wasn't going anywhere and that I could handle his big feelings. Right. Because I sat there through all of it. And eventually he came over and he sat on my lap and I said, okay, let's talk about it. Right. Like what's going on? What happened? Right. And a lot of it is miscommunication because again, they're learning. Right. So they're going to misinterpret things. They're going to think something's one way, but it's not that way. Right. Or vice versa. Or maybe as parents, we're not communicating enough. Right. But in that moment, that really showed him that 1, I wasn't scared of his feelings. 2, I was always going to be there. And 3, I loved him unconditionally. And that's the thing that we do as parents a lot too, is we withhold love when we're upset, right? And I think that's really hard for a little kid to hear. I only love you when you're good.
Well, and I don't think that's necessarily being said, but you're saying through our actions, that's what we're communicating.
Absolutely. Yes. No, not saying that everyone's running around being like, I don't love you.
Yeah.
But that's what you're saying, right? You're saying you're showing your child that I'm only present when you have, quote unquote, the feelings that I desire you to have. Right. But we all have feelings, right? We all have moments where we're upset or we're, super mad or whatever it may be. That doesn't make us bad people. Right. And so I think one of the things too is like that I remind him is just because you had a bad behavior doesn't make you a bad person. Right. Just because you did a thing that wasn't so great, that doesn't mean that's who you are. And a lot of times I think we get caught up in that, right? That our behavior means that's who we are.
Do you think at that early of an age that resonates? Like they identify with doing something bad, that they're a bad person?
I don't think necessarily that it resonates, but I think it will at a certain point in time, right?
Yeah.
So I'm not necessarily doing it for the right now. I'm doing it to shape that inner voice, right? Great movie, Inside Out. You're going to learn I'm a Disney fan, apparently. Right. When she has this like inner self, right? That's what you're talking to. Because parents are their children's inner voice.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think, starting these conversations early on, whether they understand whatever capacity of it, it builds that foundation and they start picking up. And no, that makes sense. And I think sometimes I feel like I'm pretty good of like not giving attention to the tantrum, but sometimes I can be like, okay, you can freak out right here. And granted, if we're out and about, I'm right next to her. But sometimes if we're home, I might walk into the other room, and let her have her tantrum, but maybe that's not necessarily the best approach. Maybe, it's sitting there and saying, again, at this early of an age, she might not understand, but just starting that conversation and she'll eventually pick up to understanding what that means. And maybe I'll understand more on her level of what she's experiencing.
Sure. Yeah. And it's also shaping too how you respond to things, right? So it's not always about how we're shaping them. It's about how we're shaping ourselves, right? Because as parents, we have a lot to learn. And I'm always learning, right? And something that you said that I was thinking about, right, is what if you have more than one kid, right? And you can't necessarily sit on the floor, right? Because in this scenario, I only had one child, right? Now I have two. So my response will be if he's throwing, if he's hitting, if he's doing those things, I'm going to let him know, hey, we're going to exit this space because I need to keep your brother safe. I'm going to be right outside of this gate, but I need you to start to calm down a little bit and stop throwing. And then we can come back in and talk about it. Right. But I'm standing right there. I'm just removing our younger son from the situation because I don't want him to potentially get hit or something like that in the process. Right. Yeah. And not that our son is intentionally throwing things at him or anything like that. But if he's upset and he just starts throwing, well, who knows where it's going to land. Right. So, but I'm also letting him know, right? I'm not leaving you because I'm scared of your feelings. I'm taking your brother out of the situation because I don't want him to get hurt.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's the biggest thing is just reminding them that you're not scared of who they are. And a part of who they are is these big feelings.
For sure. No, that makes a lot of sense. I feel like we could have a full other conversation on other things that the children experience. I know today we're kind of closing short, but I'm curious. Earlier in our conversation, I mentioned that you are an author and your books have won some awards. And a lot of your books focus on mindfulness. So I'd love to spend a little bit of time talking about mindfulness for toddlers. And if there's specific techniques that we can teach them that you might recommend to help toddlers cope with these big feelings.
Sure. Yeah. So, again, the whole point of writing these books was the fact that I started working with adults, and I just saw this basic lack of coping skills. And so I said, if the parents don't have them, how do I expect the children to have them? Right. So I started writing these when our youngest was actually under a year. So he'd be sleeping at night and I just started writing them. It doesn't have to be complicated. And I think that's the thing is like, we're always looking for this perfect quick fix, right? but it's not that, right? And so I think, going into some of the books, it really all kind of depends on what you want to use, right? Some of them can be loud and fun, right? Like in this book specifically, one of the activities is taking what I call like a monster breath, right? So you breathe in really deep and then you let it out, but the kids get to roar and it's kind of this fun interactive thing, right? So what you're teaching them in that moment is to deep breathe, right? Just basic deep breath, which will calm down your system, right? But they're doing it in a fun way that they don't realize now as they get to adults, they're not going to roar, or maybe they will. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
But the whole point is to kind of teach them these basic skills that they can use later on. Right. So another thing that we do is finger tracing, right? So I'm distracting them is what I'm doing, right? I'm saying, okay, trace your finger, breathe in, breathe out, right? So it's kind of this sensory, right? But we're also breathing in and breathing out and kind of calming down our system. And it's a little bit of a distraction too, right? Because they're not worried about what's going on. They're worried about this, right? And just kind of focusing on that. So there are different ways in the book that we kind of go through some of those things. And I think I just try to make it this really fun activity so that way kids could get into it, parents could get into it, and hopefully the parents take something away from it too.
Absolutely. We started kind of doing the deep breathing with her. At least she's not picking up on it yet, but we're like trying to show her. I've even seen the thing where you like blow out the candles and you do one at a time. And I don't know if she's just like so deep in her frustration or still relatively young to understand what's going on. But again, coming back to just starting the foundation, these conversations and mimicking what we're doing. And I love that kind of playful approach of like the monster breath, and you just make it fun. Are there any other, so you mentioned the monster breath, the tracing, any other techniques to kind of help center them and provide some mindfulness?
Sure. Yeah. So again, it's sort of about teaching them to come back to center, right? So I actually took 3 or 4 classes in meditation and mindfulness when I was in college. I took the first one, and I'm going to be really, really honest. When I took the first one, I was like, oh, this is so great. It's 9:30 in the morning. I'm going to get to sleep in the back of class. This is going to be amazing. Right. I'm getting an A for sleeping. And eventually, as time went on, I kept, showing up to class, and I realized, okay, maybe I should participate. Right. And so eventually I just started to learn like how far I could go. And then it became a challenge as to how long I could meditate without allowing myself to have these thoughts. Right. So one of the biggest rules of meditation and mindfulness is to be able to let things go. Right. So how I like to think about it, and this is a lot more for parents, but just because there's a tornado going on around me doesn't mean that I need to respond, right? So when our child is throwing a tantrum, right, just because there's a tornado going on doesn't mean I need to respond to it. And that's the thing is like we're always sort of responding, right? So just taking a step back, taking a deep breath and saying, okay, like how are we going to handle this in a calm and rational way? Right? Because a lot of times we come in hot and heavy and we're ready to like fix the problem, but you're kind of making it a little bit worse. Right. Because then you're mad and then you're worked up and then your kid gets more worked up because they see you worked up. So I think really just learning for kids and for parents. Right. So another thing we do is belly breathing. So if you have, and this is in the book as well, but if you have the kid like lay on their back and they start breathing, what I'll do is I'll put a stuffed animal, whatever stuffed animal they want on their stomach, or they can use their hands if they don't have a stuffed animal. So like if they're in class or something like that. And just watching your stomach go up and down, right? And watching that stuffed animal and just really sort of kind of zoning out, right? And just kind of watching that progress and really slowing down. So one of the biggest things is just slowing down, right? And taking it moment by moment. And again, for little kids, right? We're sort of managing the tantrum in the moment. We're not necessarily changing what's happening, right? They're probably still going to have tantrums. It's going to happen. It's developmentally appropriate. Right. And I think that's the thing is, again, we as parents always want to fix things, but it's developmentally appropriate. So like, yay for your kid, right? They're developing appropriately. And something as an example that I know some people might not find as entertaining as I do is like lying, right? A lot of parents get upset with lying, but lying means that your child's brain is functioning the way that it should. It means that your child is evolving and their brain is like evolving along with them, right? So it might seem like a bad thing, but that means that their brain is like wiring in a different way and they're learning more things, right? And so to me, that's so fascinating. And I know some people are like lying, right? But that's normal behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think we're always trying to like make our children perfect, but I don't know that that's ever going to happen, right? They're not going to be perfect and that's okay. And so I think just allowing yourself to be like, hey, they're having this tantrum and that's okay. They're freaking out at the grocery store and that's okay. Every parent has been there, right? Where their child is flailing on the floor at the grocery store, right? So I think not worrying about what's around you and focusing on how to ensure that your child has everything that they need.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I feel like that's a unique perspective on the line. I mean, I don't, it's a different way of looking at it. I don't know if I would, go down the thing of like, be excited about it when it happens or like condone it, but it is a very unique. And that's why I even think about even the tantrums. It's like a next level, like their brain is developing, they're in a new growth. But it's like, okay, how do we take this information and handle it in the best capacity? And one thing you mentioned too is kind of the self-regulation of parents, because it can be, especially if you're a stay-at-home mom or a solo parent, or you're just got a lot on your plate. It's so easy to snap when this stuff is continuously happening. But again, remembering our brains are so developed and theirs are still figuring it out. So coming in with that is a helpful approach. But sometimes in the moment, it's hard to kind of take in, okay, let's be mindful. Let's take a step back. Are there any techniques or advice you'd give for parents when they're in the moment of it, to remind themselves of a better approach to going about this?
Sure. Yeah. So, again, I'm coming from a place of like, I've been doing this since he was born. Right. And so I know that not everyone has had access to some of the, like the classes and the things that I have. Right. So I'm absolutely aware of that. So I think again, like the emotions aren't the problem. Your reaction to them is. Right. So all emotions are welcome, but how do we deal with all of them, right? And to say that I don't have moments where I'm done, right, is unrealistic, right? I'm not perfect every day, every second, right? I don't respond the way that I want to in the moment, but what I can do is when I start to do that, I start to rewire my brain to be like, oh, wait, I should stop. Or that's not how I want to be, right? And that's being cognizant and that's being like, consciously aware of the things that you say, right? So slowing down enough to be like, oh, I didn't want to say it like that. And then something that we struggle with as parents is apologizing. You're allowed to have feelings too. You don't need to be perfect, but what you do need to do is acknowledge that you weren't perfect and say, hey, now I'm going to apologize, right? So that's when you get on their level and you say, hey, I'm really sorry that I responded that way. Let's try to do it different. Show them that you're a human. Show them you have feelings too.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I think we can start that at an early age as well. And it, maybe if they were fearful of the way you reacted, I feel like that can kind of help just kind of heal that a little bit. I also think to the point of one thing we didn't really touch upon, but maybe there's a lot of noise and stimulation going on in the environment that's creating, I feel like we could spend a whole episode talking about some of the triggers for tantrums. But I think when you're in the midst of a tantrum, looking at the environment, is there music on? Is there TV on? Are there a lot of people in the room? I'm guessing kind of changing up the environment, calming down, slowing down, quieting the noise can help their inner dialogue start to quiet as well.
Yeah. So one of the things that I read in a Nordic parenting book was, it was a saying, it said, just add water. And so if you think about it, right, when we go to these botanical gardens or we go in nature, right, what is one of the most calming things you can find? Probably water, right? So sometimes we'll say, okay, let's go take a bath or let's take a shower. Or you know what, you really wanted to play in the sink and do dishes with dad, fine, right? Sometimes changing up the setting is so helpful to just kind of reset what's going on, right? And a lot of times when you say like, checking the environment, right? I think about when I come home from work sometimes and I'm already overwhelmed, right? And then I come in and the TV's like blasting and there's this noise and that noise and people are screaming and the dog is barking. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm so overwhelmed. Right. And so I have to go and turn the TV down and I'm like, telling the dog to stop. Right. And all of those things. So to assume that kids don't get overwhelmed as well is crazy. Right. So turning down the TV, getting on their level, being present, looking them in the eye, saying, hey, I'm here. Let's figure this out together. And I think that's the biggest thing is let's figure it out together, not you go figure it out in the corner by yourself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think being supportive and saying I'm here for you. And I also think about, especially as kids that are in school, you have this busy day. There's probably a lot of distractions. You're probably being the tough kid because I've heard a lot of times they come home and they release and that's when they have their biggest tantrums because they finally feel safe with you and they've been tough all day, but also remembering they've probably had a lot of stimulation, a lot of overwhelm. And so getting them outside, calming down the noise, getting them to play and move their bodies, I can imagine can really make an impact.
Yeah. I mean, I could go on for days about this topic because we live in a world where there are so many children who are being diagnosed with things like autism and ADHD, and not to say that that isn't valid. However, I can envision a world where if I'm one teacher to 30 students, what do I want all those students to do? I want them to sit down and be quiet and behave, right? But something that I think we need to remember is like, and I'm sure I'm going to ask you this, I'm going to throw this out. Like, how long do you think my 4-year-old is supposed to be able to sit in a chair?
Yeah. Well, we've looked into homeschooling and alternative approaches. So I'm with you in that. I just can't imagine. Most adults can't even do that now.
Yeah. So 1 minute for every year. So he's supposed to be able to sit in a chair for 4 minutes and you expect him to sit in a chair for hours on end. Mm-hmm. It just doesn't make sense. And you can't make it make sense because it doesn't. Right? Children are supposed to be developing in a way where they focus on, and that's another part of the Nordic parenting, right? Is focusing on outdoor play, being able to be outside in nature, kind of not being so contained, right? I go into schools, right? I work in schools. And they're some of the most depressing places I've ever seen. Everything's gray. There's nothing on the walls. There's nothing it's like, how do you function this way? And then you have a teacher who I admire so much, but they're so overworked. Mm-hmm. They have 30 plus kids. And it's like, how do you learn?
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of us went through the public school system and we came out somewhat normal, but it's like, we want to raise our children different. We want to give them the best of the best and not just produce normal or just decent. We want to give them the environment to help them foster and grow to the best of their ability. And I think that's why a lot of people are looking at a lot of alternative approaches to schooling and education, because of exactly these reasons of, a better ratio from teacher to student, to being outdoors, to moving their body, to creating learning environments that are appropriate for them. Because like we were discussing, a girl's going to learn generally different than a boy will, or they're going to have different needs. And so, yeah, that absolutely makes sense. Well, I think this conversation is so important. And I know I gained some valuable and practical tips on what I can apply with my daughter. If people want to know more, they want to know about your books, where can they find you? And what is the name of your books?
Yeah. Okay. So you can find me on Instagram, and I promise you I talk a lot about all of this stuff. So you'll get to kind of see my life and what's going on with me and, our homeschooling process, and kind of all of those things. So it's Dr. Taylor Harper on Instagram. As far as the books go, it is Dr. Taylor Harper, I believe, Dr. Taylor Harper Books. .org. So you can check it out there. You can check it out on Amazon. So I would say my website particularly is where you're going to find everything up to date. So I'm going to start putting resources up there that people can use. But also the books. So number one is Mantra Monster. You can find that on Amazon or, like I said, on my website. And the cool thing about my website is you'll get it signed and all those great things, which I love doing. And then let me pull this one off. So I don't have any cool stickers on it, but this is Shavasana Sun. So as you can tell, similar concept going on there. And then I'm actually coming out with 2 new books that just came out about both of my sons. And so life lessons through cooking and baking. So our oldest loves to bake. I got him in the kitchen early and now he's obsessed. So you'll see us cooking and baking on Instagram and all those fun things. But yeah, so it's life lessons through baking and cooking, and they're just fun. And so I'm super excited for those as well. So yeah, you can check out the website. You can follow me on Instagram. And yeah, that's kind of where you'll get everything related to me.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for being here and giving us your time and just sharing all these insights and tips. And I think a lot of people will walk away with some really good, valuable information.
I hope so. That's the point. I really want to help families better understand their kids and just normalize the fact that, like, kids are kids. Absolutely. And so to think that we always have to be perfect, realistic.
Yep, that makes sense. Awesome. Well, thank you again for being here, and we'll chat soon.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, take care.